distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I wish to thank the Mylapore Academy for arranging this talk and giving me an opportunity of placing the Sri Lankan Tamil point of view on this accord before this distinguished audience. The question has been raised whether this accord will work and how to make it work. The attack on Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi the day after he signed the accord, and the attempt on the life of President Jayawardena, resulting in the death of one of his district ministers and injury to several ministers and members of parliament, shows the forces we are up against and the forces that have to be countered if this agreement, if this accord is to survive and to work. But I think the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and President Jayawardena have set about it in the correct way in arranging to have the presence of the Indian Army as a peacekeeping force in sufficient numbers in Sri Lanka to deal with any lawlessness that may be unleashed in an attempt to upset this agreement. India arranged another ceasefire in 1985 between the Tamil militants and the Sri Lankan armed forces. At that time, we urged them to have a proper monitoring of the ceasefire, and we impressed on them that the ceasefire will never work unless there was proper monitoring, and that too by an Indian presence in the monitoring committee. They accepted Jayawardena's suggestion of a local committee that totally failed, and that attempt at bringing about a ceasefire 2 years ago in June 1985 failed because of lack of courage on the part of the government of Sri Lanka to invite, to accept an Indian presence to see that the ceasefire was observed. If they had done it at that time, I think several thousands of lives could have been saved. On the present occasion, as I said, what guarantees the observance of the ceasefire and guarantees the survival of this agreement is the presence of the Indian peacekeeping force. And I would like to use this opportunity to impress on all of you that India needs have no qualms of conscience in having the Indian army in Sri Lanka, because it is in the interest of the whole of Sri Lanka that the Indian army should be there for quite some time. As far as the Tamil people are concerned, I don't mean to say that we have no reservations on this agreement. We have conveyed to the Prime Minister of India, the night before he left for Colombo, our reservations with regard to some of the provisions of this agreement. But as the chairman very correctly pointed out, when you seek to have a compromise, you cannot have 100% satisfaction on either side. You will have to give and take, and it is in that spirit that the Tamil people, I can say, have accepted the compromise involved in this agreement and are willing to give it a trial, give it a chance to succeed. That is the view of the vast majority of the Tamil people in Sri Lanka. There is no doubt that it has not given us all that we wanted, but it has certainly satisfied some of the aspirations of the Tamil people and removed some of the long-standing grievances under which the Tamil people in Sri Lanka labored for the last 3 decades. In 1956, June 5th, the late Prime Minister Mr. Bandaranaike introduced in the Sri Lanka Parliament the Sinhala-only Act. That marked the beginning of ethnic conflict and violence in Sri Lanka. On the day the Sinhala-only Act was introduced in Parliament, we as members of Parliament representing the Tamil people, I am referring to what happened 31 years ago. At that time I was a young member of Parliament just elected there. We performed satyagraha opposite Parliament. We went and sat there, exposing ourselves to the rain and the sun, inflicting suffering on ourselves. A crowd of 10,000 was set up to attack us. They beat us up with clubs, pelted us with stones, and in fact my head was cracked in 2 places, and my whole dress was drenched in blood. I had to tie a handkerchief round my gaping wound on the head and walk into Parliament at 2 o'clock with blood-stained clothes. There was a hushed silence in Parliament, and Bandaranaike, in order to get over the awkward situation, tried to make a joke of it. He said, "Honorable wounds of war," looking at the injury on my head. But that night, there was an attack on Tamils in the eastern province in Ampara area. That afternoon, Tamils were pulled out of cars and beaten up on the roads in Colombo. No less a person than the present Chief Justice, Mr. Sharvananda, who was then an advocate in Colombo, was one of those pulled out of his car and beaten up on the roads in Colombo on that day. That was the first occasion when violence, mob violence, was unleashed against the Tamil people. As we continue to agitate for our language rights in a totally non-violent way, the violent reaction on the Sinhala side increased. For nearly 20 years or more, there was no violent reaction on the Tamil side. Our agitation, our struggle was totally non-violent. So much so that no less a person than the late Shri Rajagopalachari wrote in the Swadandra in 1961, when we had a mass satyagraha campaign in the northern and eastern provinces, when for 57 days we paralyzed the entire administration of the northern and eastern provinces with our totally non-violent mass struggle. He said that the whole struggle was carried on in the true Gandhian spirit. Not even the sort of violence that erupted under Gandhiji's leadership in the campaigns that were carried on at that time was seen in the campaign that we had in 1961. What did Mrs. Bandaranaike's government do? Ultimately, they could not tire us out, they could not do anything. Police violence they used on us, even that didn't provoke any violence on the part of our volunteers. On the 17th of April 1961, they declared an emergency, brought out the army, arrested all of us leaders and took us and locked us up in the army camp in Colombo and unleashed army violence for the first time on the Tamil Satyagrahis. This is how the violence of the state went on increasing, which ultimately inevitably led to the violent reaction of the Tamil youth. For nearly 1 decade we have had violence matched by violence on both sides. And the government of Sri Lanka, President Jayawardena and his government added fuel to the fire by closing the door on the democratic process, totally discrediting the democratically elected representatives of the Tamil people, discrediting them by failing to honor promises given, failing to implement laws passed, failing to adequately work the system of decentralization which we accepted as a compromise. It is that which led to the crisis that the whole country faced during the last 4 years. For the first time after 1983, the Tamil people, particularly the people in the northern and eastern provinces, are breathing the air of freedom, are breathing the air of freedom from fear, freedom from the fear that at any moment death may be lurking round the corner. That is the atmosphere in which our people lived. That is why they welcomed this accord. They welcomed the presence of the Indian peacekeeping force. This accord could never have evoked that degree of enthusiastic support from the Tamil people in Sri Lanka if not for the accompanying peacekeeping force, which meant freedom for them from the atrocities of the Sri Lankan armed forces. They want that freedom to continue till an alternative peacekeeping force, till an alternative law and order machinery can be worked out, which will be under their control, which will be under the control of the Tamil people in the Tamil province. That is an absolute necessity if this accord is to work. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the position of inferiority which was imposed on the Tamil people with the passage of the Sinhala Only Act in 1956 is sought to be removed by the provision in this agreement to make Tamil also an official language. That is what we were fighting for the last 3 decades, for the last 31 years. We wanted that Tamil also should be an official language. That was the basis on which independence was granted to Sri Lanka. Prior to independence, President Jayawardena himself introduced a motion in the then State Council in 1944 that Sinhala and Tamil shall be the official languages. The Solberry Commission which came accepted that as the basis of equality between the two linguistic groups, which was ensured by making both the languages the official languages. When an attempt was made by the Sinhala majority to go back on that principle of equality by making Sinhala the only official language, thereby placing the stamp of perpetual inferiority on the Tamil people, they naturally resisted that. They started agitating against that. And from that point onwards started the conflict between the two major groups. It is significant that this conflict, at least a solution has been worked out for this conflict only by the intervention of India. We tried so many solutions by ourselves. So many pacts and agreements were signed. In 1957, Bandaranaike signed the Bandaranaike-Chelvanayakam Pact. In 1960, Mrs. Bandaranaike came to an agreement with us, agreeing to implement the pact which Bandaranaike had abrogated earlier. In 1965, Mr. Datli Senanayake and President Jayawardena, who was then number 2 to Datli Senanayake, signed an agreement with Mr. Chelvanayake. But all those failed because the Sinhala leadership didn't have the courage to honor their word, didn't have the courage to implement solemn agreements they entered into with the Tamil leadership. That is why I think it is realizing that President Jayawardena at the press conference immediately after signing this accord said that lack of courage on their part was one of the factors that militated against this sort of peace being brought in earlier. All those failed, and that was also one of the factors that contributed to the emergence of the demand for a separate state. This was not something which the Tamil people sought after. The Tamil people of Sri Lanka always wanted to find a solution within the framework of the unity of the country. Even in 1956, when Sinhala only was imposed on us, there were some of our leaders, like the late Professor Sundaralingam, who put forward the suggestion that the Tamils should now ask for a separate state. Our late leader, Mr. Chelvanayakam, and the federal party to which we belong, and which the Tamil people overwhelmingly supported, resisted that demand. We fought the demand for a separate state and defeated it in the Tamil areas. But 20 years later, in 1976, as a result of the failure of several agreements reached, as a result of the emergence of state terrorism, state violence against the Tamil people, we ourselves felt that we could no longer live with the Sinhalese, and thereby emerged the demand for a separate state. That is why I said in one of my press interviews that for 27 years the Tamil people never asked for separation. From 1949 to 1976, the demand of the Tamil people was for a federal solution to the problem. The recognition of a Tamil homeland where the Tamil people will be able to look after their affairs in the same way as the various states in India are doing, and be united with the rest of the country in a federal union, is what the Tamil people demanded. When all that was totally disregarded and rejected by the Sinhala leadership, we felt that we had to internationalize the problem. And it was with that idea, if we could not solve it within a united Sri Lanka, we had to solve it outside a united Sri Lanka. And once we put forward the demand for an independent Tamil state in 1976, it became no longer an internal problem. It became a problem for the whole world, because we based it on our claim to be a separate nation with the right of self-determination, which is an internationally recognized right. That was how the demand for a Tamil state emerged, and it is not surprising that a solution for the problem has now come in through an international accord, an accord between India and Sri Lanka. The object with which we sought to internationalize the problem by putting forward the demand for a separate state has definitely borne fruit. Ladies and gentlemen, we sometimes have a habit of speaking at length, and I have so much to say that I may overstep the time limit. I want to make only one other point. There have been several pacts signed between India and Sri Lanka. Even prior to independence, in respect of the Tamils of Indian origin who were in the plantation areas, there was the Bajpai-Senanayaka agreement. After independence, Sri Lanka introduced the citizenship laws which de-citizenized and disfranchised 1 million Tamils, Tamils of recent Indian origin, Tamils living in the plantation areas, workers who have contributed, who continue to contribute 60% of the foreign exchange earnings of Sri Lanka, were disfranchised, de-citizenized, and made stateless persons without any political rights. At that time, there were talks between the then Prime Minister D.S. Senanayaka and Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. They couldn't agree on the terms of the law which was to grant citizenship to those people who were de-citizenized. So without Nehru's agreement, D.S. Senanayaka introduced the Indian and Pakistani Citizenship Act in December 1948, on the very year of Sri Lanka's independence. That didn't solve the problem, that only created the problem. In 1954, there was the Nehru-Kotalavala Pact. That was another attempt to solve it, but that failed to solve it, and that failed. In 1964, there was the Srimavo Shastri Pact. Even that didn't solve the Tamil problem. In fact, it created a further problem, a problem here of Tamil repatriates who came and started roaming the roads unemployed without any adequate provision for their own welfare in this country. In fact, Sri Lanka entered into another agreement handing over Kachadivu to India entered into another agreement handing over Kachadivu to Sri Lanka, which I do not know whether it was correct or not, but which was definitely an attempt on the part of India to lean backwards, to accommodate and to be good to the younger brother, the little neighbor. All these facts that I referred to went on that basis. But I think a stage was reached when Sri Lanka became a positive menace, not only to India but to the whole region. Using the conflict between the Tamils and the Sinhalese, the rising of Tamil militancy, they introduced elements into Sri Lanka which endangered the security of India, which endangered the security of the whole region, which brought the Indian Ocean into the vortex of international conflict. And that is what necessitated the present agreement. The present agreement falls into two parts. One part is a solution to the Sri Lankan Tamil problem. The other part is a solution to the security problem of India, to the security problem of this region, to the whole problem of peace in the Indian Ocean. If not for the one part, it should succeed at least for the other part, so that it is up to everyone in India to see that this accord, this agreement succeeds, because in its success depends not only the future of the Tamils in Sri Lanka, but the future of peace in the Indian Ocean. The removal of the elements endangering the security of India on the southern extremity of this country. Therefore, whatever one's reservations on this accord may be, I feel that this is a great achievement of Indian diplomacy after independence. As a student of foreign affairs, I feel that what could not be achieved in Bangladesh by war with Pakistan has been achieved in Sri Lanka by this accord. And incidentally, we, the small Tamil community there, also have some measure of safety and security through this agreement. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, one has to look at this accord not merely as one meant to solve the Sri Lankan Tamil problem, but in the larger perspective of peace in the Indian Ocean, of security in the region, and of the security of India itself. And therefore, all of us, whether we be Tamils in Sri Lanka, as I said, whatever reservations we may have, or Tamils in India, or others in India, whatever anger they may have against Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi or against President Jayawardena, should pull their weight, give their full cooperation for making a success of this accord. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.